here on the show, classicwrestling.com. One more note before we get to our two main interviews this week, Tom. I asked people if they want me to bring back Impressionist Jim Ross, and the vote was overwhelmingly yes. And we're probably going to do that. I'll keep people posted. But enough people asked me about Jim Ross this week that I got to address this. So I guess Jim Ross had Cornette on his show this week, and I heard the very end of it where he said something along the lines of, I guess Jim kept saying my name when he would plug the Experience or the drive-thru.
I actually heard the show, if unless you want to go without me interrupting.
Well, I'll just say the thing that everyone keeps commenting on was the thing at the very end where Jim Ross said you could listen, I guess, to Jim Cornette and the great Brian Last, whoever the hell that is. Just kidding. Not really. And the timing of it was very funny. So let me give everyone a little bit of the backstory. I've always said Jim Ross was an asshole and a prick, and I stand by that. And believe me, many other people do as well. And when his wife passed away, which was horrible and unfortunate, we took a break, a hiatus from talking about Jim Ross in a negative light and from having the Impressionist Jim Ross character here on the show. And that was that. And then what next happened was he put out the cover of his upcoming biography, autobiography, I guess. He didn't write it, but we'll call it an autobiography. And on the cover, it has his picture, and then it says written by Jim Ross, and there's another co-writer there listed. The name Scott Williams isn't there. Scott Williams was the one working with Jim Ross on this book. Scott Williams unfortunately passed away about a year ago, weeks after he had appeared on the Jim Cornette Experience. That was the only time I ever spoke to Scott. And Scott was friends with Bix. Bix knew Scott well. Bix held Scott in high regard. I had never spoken to him. I knew of him. I saw his name each week in the Observer. I read his books that he did with Bill Watts and Jim Duggan and did the ECW book. And when we got on the phone for the Jim Cornette show, the first thing he did off air was say that he was a big fan of the 605 and of me. He specifically said of me, and I was blown away. That was like one of the first moments in the show, even though it was months into it, where I was like, wow, I can't believe this show is reaching people like this, who don't just listen, but they're fans, they enjoy it. And if you go back and listen to that interview, in the middle of the interview, at one point he says, like Brian Last would say, fuck those guys, which tells you he was listening to this show every week, because by that point in time, I don't think I had ever said fuck those guys on Cornette's show. And then he died, and it was very sad. You know, we profiled some of his books for the Book of the Week previously. And then Jim Ross put out this book cover, and Scott Williams' name isn't on it. Scott Williams was the one working with Jim Ross on the book, and all of a sudden he dies, and his name's not on the book cover. So I tweeted something out. When he put out that tweet with the book cover, someone sent it to me. I don't follow Jim Ross. I don't know why anyone would. But I went to his page, and I saw that tweet, and I commented, why isn't Scott Williams' name on the book cover? And I put 3 question marks. I didn't get a response directly. But what I could say is, and I don't want to say too much here about this specific thing, Jim Ross complained about me to someone who is a mutual friend of ours. And in his complaint, he mischaracterized the situation. I may have Bix come on the show to talk about what he knows, but I'll just put it this way. Scott Williams' name wasn't on the book cover, and it wasn't going to be on the book cover until some pressure was placed on Jim Ross. And all of a sudden, everything changed. Bix and a guy named Corey, who was one of Scott's co-workers, both got on Jim Ross. So between them and me, who he openly, well, I shouldn't say openly, who he quietly complained about, hoping it would shut me up, he knew that the story was out there and it was going to get bigger. And that's why all of a sudden Jim Ross tweeted out the other day, and I'm paraphrasing here, to all the shit disturbers whose business it is, Scott Williams' name will be on the cover of the book as it should be. Now think about that statement right there. Think about the venom in it. To all the shit disturbers out there whose business it is, Scott Williams' name will be on the book cover as it should be. Well, if it wasn't for those shit disturbers, which I'm proudly one of, his name wouldn't have been on the book cover because you were hoping no one would notice or say anything. Not me, not Bix, not Corey, not Scott's widow. But now he's going to be on the book cover because of the shit disturbers whose business it is. Jim Ross is full of shit, and fuck that guy. Fuck that guy, not just for the Scott Williams thing. Fuck that guy for years of being a prick to people. Fuck that guy for his creepiness to women. The guy just did New Japan. He's horrible on New Japan. He's not a good commentator, period, anymore. But if you're going to have him on commentary, you know what? Put him in the role of being the color commentator, not the play-by-play guy, because he can't cut it anymore. He's slow. He doesn't have any of the abilities he once had to feign enthusiasm, to energetically call a wrestling match. It's gone. It's been gone for years. He got a free pass for a long time. In 1989, he was the best wrestling commentator in the world, maybe the best ever. He's not that guy anymore. He's a guy who doesn't give a shit, unless the WWE calls and then he cleans up. I could tell you I heard from multiple people that he was drinking on the air for the New Japan show. I know rumors got out there. People said, oh, he was, and he spun a story out there that you saw in different places that, well, you know, New Japan didn't prep me. There was no production meeting. You didn't know the names of the wrestlers. You had a binder with their pictures and their names in front of you. It wasn't New Japan's fault that you were unprofessional. It wasn't New Japan's fault that you were unprepared. Maybe if you spent 5 minutes before you got there and watched a video on YouTube, or maybe if you paid attention while you were calling the matches that you do commentary for on Axis each week, you would know the storylines. And you would know the wrestlers. Maybe if you gave a shit and had a little bit of pride in your work, you'd be able to lose yourself in your commentary and pretend like you're calling an athletic event instead of this bullshit blurring the lines crap like you're doing your podcast. I can only say I heard from the person who sat behind him, who heard him asking for whiskey all night and saw him drinking. I've seen pictures of the glass he was drinking from. I saw pictures of the binders with all the information that was in front of him. And I also know that there's stories coming out of the New Japan camp, as well as the Axis TV camp, as well as a few other people who were backstage, that Jim Ross was very unprofessional that day. Why am I saying all this? Because you know what? The whole thing of the great Brian Last, whoever the hell he is, just kidding, not really. The fact that that happened after he complained about me bringing to light the fact that he was going to shaft Scott Williams' memory from that book cover pisses me off. And it's disingenuous. And Jim Ross, I know you listen, you fucking idiot. If you're going to do commentary anymore, be professional, prepare yourself so you know who's actually wrestling and you know the storylines. And you don't just think, well, I got the WWE. I don't have to give a shit about this other thing anymore. Notice he was a prick to so many people until the WWE got rid of him. And then all of a sudden he had to be nice to people. And he still was a prick to a lot of people. So that's it for now. I may bring back an impressionist Jim Ross, but I wanted to get this off my chest this week. The Scott Williams thing infuriated me. Because Scott Williams was a good guy. Ask Dave Meltzer. Ask Bix. Ask anyone who dealt with Scott Williams. A good guy. A family guy. A smart guy, and a guy who took a lot of pride in what he did in his work, and he was this close, and we still haven't seen the finished cover. You know, I wouldn't be completely surprised if all of a sudden the cover comes out, and Jim Ross is like, oh, well, it wasn't me, it was the publisher. But Scott Williams was going to be omitted from that cover until me and Bix and a few others spoke up. And for doing so, we were called shit disturbers. It was like when I interviewed him when he was on Jimmy's show, and Jim said to me to ask questions before we got on air. He said, ask questions of him. And every question I asked of him, he would shoot it down and then confirm my thesis in his answer. And that's pretty much what he did with that tweet. He shot down the shit disturbers who were causing trouble, but then he confirmed everything by saying his name will be on the cover. All of a sudden. I don't know what else there is to say about it, Tom. You know, I'll bring you in here if you have any thoughts about all this. You know, you know me pretty well. I'm a pretty straightforward guy. I'm a pretty honest guy. I care a lot about doing the right thing. And I don't know, man. You treat people good. Treat people good on the way up. You're going to see them again on the way down. Not you act like a prick to people on the way up. And then if you need them, you kiss their ass and then you act like a prick again.
Listening to you on this end, I didn't know a lot of the story. I obviously am a fan of Jim Ross's, as you mentioned, play-by-play in his prime. He was great. I can't say I haven't listened to his show, but I did hear, I went back and listened to, I watched, the tweets and so forth, and I went back and listened to the show the one you referred to. And it seemed he was a little bit dismissive of you, if you don't mind me saying, which is really strange and bizarre to me. And that was, let's not get it twisted from my end. I still have sympathy for the grieving process, because I couldn't imagine, the terrible situation that he went through. But this was well before when I listened to the show, and he seemed to almost come across like I'm here to be interviewed by Jimmy and not Brian Last, when you were really providing pretty cool questions, pretty provocative questions. And you said all you had to say, and I guess I can't go any further. So, it was just, it's just a weird situation. And I know how you feel about it. And you wouldn't come out like this against the man unless you had your shit straight and you knew the facts. So I'll let it stand at that.
And just, for so many years, so many people were sympathetic to him for what they perceived his treatment as by Vince McMahon and Hunter and various people up there. Look at the other side of it, which I've done, lately. Again, can't take anything away from him from, 84 to 92. He was a phenomenal play-by-play guy. Phenomenal. Jim Ross at his peak was exceptional. Go watch those Flair matches from 89. You know what? There's no other commentator in wrestling history you could have dropped into those matches that would have done a better job than Jim Ross. Nobody. And he did one with Bob Caudle, who's phenomenal. He did him with Gordon Soley, who it's maybe the last great moment of Gordon Soley's career, calling the I Quit match with Terry Funk. Jim Ross was amazing. But he hasn't been that for a long time. And look at his history, right? We all say, like, oh, poor Jim Ross, the way he was treated by Vince McMahon and Hunter and various people. He worked for Leroy McGurk, who was blind, and the entire time he was working for him, he was informing a rival promoter, his former partner, Bill Watts, everything that was going on. Leroy goes out of business. Hey, what do you know? Jim Ross gets a job with Bill Watts. Bill Watts, who yells at people and had a very harsh way of dealing with things. We all know that. And you know what? Jim Ross got yelled at just as much as everyone. So now he's getting abused at work. Goes to work for Turner. Hey, the story's changed throughout the years. For a long time, people said he helped push out Tony Schiavone. Who knows? Who knows? I think they have now said that wasn't exactly the case. Who knows? But I know that everyone hated Jim Herd, and who was Jim Herd's buddy, drinking with him, kissing his ass? The office stooge, Jim Ross. And as soon as Bill Watts left, at the beginning of 93, they couldn't wait to throw him out. And he was the first guy they got rid of after Bill Watts. Then he didn't know what he was going to do. And he got the WWF job right away. And he went in there, debuted at WrestleMania 9, and was he still good? I don't know. But that style certainly didn't fit his strengths. I think that's a very fair assessment. And they dumped him, within a year and a half. And again, he didn't know what he was going to do. I remember there was an ad in the Observer that, for however much money, you could send Jim Ross questions and he would record answers on audio cassettes and send them to you. He's good to the fans when he needs the fans. But when things are going good for him, talk to people. Ask around. He's a prick to fans. He always has. Tom, am I lying? He may not. You've heard people. I don't know if you've ever run into him. Am I lying? Am I saying something you've never heard before that's outrageous?
No. A couple of my interactions have been okay, but I've heard a lot of negative things. It's a weird thing. It's the first time I've heard, actually, probably in the history of this podcast, you being so passionate and honest about your viewpoint, and you brought up things that I didn't know, and I'm sure a lot of people out there don't know.
And there's a video out there. I want to bring this up, and this is a whole crazy story. I got this with all those tapes I got from Bill Watts years ago, and I sent it to Bob Barnett, a copy of it, and Bob sold it to some guy. I won't even say his name on the air. This goof put it on YouTube, but like a disclaimer, like, I own the rights to this, and this is my video. It's Jim Ross in 1986 sitting around waiting to cut promos. Go watch that video. For all of you that think he's been a miserable prick just the last few years, go watch that video of Jim Ross for 20 minutes sitting there waiting to cut promos, and tell me if that's someone you'd want to spend 5 minutes of your life with. He's always been miserable. That's one of the reasons why Vince and everyone got on him. He's always been miserable. He's a miserable guy. A miserable guy. And you know what? He knows the truth. He knows what he was going to do to Scott Williams. He knows that Scott Williams, he was going to give him a dedication in the book, but not put him on the cover. And I'll say this too. Jim Ross's claim that Scott Williams didn't actually write anything for the book. Well, hope that the manuscript doesn't get out, Jim. Hope that somehow one of these days on Twitter, someone doesn't tweet out what Scott wrote. And then we'll find out who's telling the truth. But I'm sure I've annoyed everyone. I'm sure no one wants to hear me go off about this, but it bothered me just because, like I said, Scott Williams was a good guy. I only talked to him one time, and it meant a lot to me that he was a fan of the show. It meant a lot to me. And Bix, who's a great friend of mine, has always spoken incredibly highly of Scott Williams and how helpful and friendly he was. And I know other people who have done the same. So that really bothered me, really, really pissed me off. And the timing of him making these little, stupid snide comments, whatever, miserable comments from a miserable man on his show. It's funny the timing, funny it happens, pretends like he doesn't know who I am, right after he complained about the fact that I brought this up on Twitter. Didn't complain to me, didn't tell me, hey, you got it wrong, or hey, please don't do this. He's got my email address. Trust me, he has my email address. He could have contacted me. He didn't. I don't know. I'm taking the show down, Tom. Do some impressions.
Well, you pretty much shot my load on impressions earlier, but the top 10's over, and you got